Imagine that you wake up one morning and look at your spouse across the breakfast table. The person sitting there looks exactly like your spouse. They sound exactly like your spouse. They have the same mannerisms, the same memories, the same responses to every question you ask. Every objective indicator available to you confirms that this is the person you have lived with for decades. And yet you are completely, unshakably certain that they are not. They are an imposter. Someone, or something, has replaced your spouse with a replica. The original has been taken somewhere, perhaps held somewhere, perhaps harmed. The person in front of you is not your spouse, but a copy, an impersonation, a simulacrum occupying your spouse's life while your real spouse is gone. No evidence can move you from this conviction. The imposter's insistence that they are real only makes you more suspicious. Your own memories of years of shared life feel real, but they are now evidence that the imposter has been in place for some time, not evidence that no replacement has occurred. The certainty is absolute, all-consuming, and impervious to argument. This is the Capgras delusion, first described by the French psychiatrist Joseph Capgras in 1923 and named for him. It is not a metaphor, not a literary device, and not a cultural trope. It is a specific neurological condition that affects real people, usually in the context of schizophrenia, dementia, traumatic brain injury, or certain other neurological conditions, and whose mechanism reveals something profound about how the brain constructs the experience of recognition. The neuroscience of the Capgras delusion begins with the architecture of face recognition. When you look at a face, a spouse, a parent, a close friend, two things happen simultaneously in your brain. The visual cortex processes the perceptual features of the face, the arrangement of the eyes, the shape of the nose and jaw, the proportions of the face's geometry. This information travels along what neuroscientists call the ventral visual stream to the fusiform face area, a region in the temporal lobe specifically specialized for face processing. The fusiform face area compares the incoming face percept against stored representations of known faces and generates a recognition signal. But recognition alone is not the full experience of seeing someone you know. There is also familiarity, the warm, automatic sense of connection and emotional belonging that accompanies seeing a familiar face. This component is generated by a separate pathway. The processed face representation connects to the amygdala and related limbic structures, which generate the autonomic and emotional response associated with recognizing someone significant. In most people, these two pathways work in concert. The visual recognition and the emotional familiarity response are triggered together by the same face, and together they produce the complete experience of recognition. This is my spouse, and I feel the connection of that relationship. In Capgras delusion, this coupling appears to be broken. The neurologist V.S. Ramachandran, who has written extensively about the Capgras delusion, was among the first to articulate the disconnection hypothesis clearly and to test it empirically. Ramachandran's key insight was that the Capgras delusion specifically involves close emotional relationships. It is almost always the most emotionally significant people in the patient's life who are experienced as imposters, not strangers or casual acquaintances. A patient with Capgras delusion might look at their spouse and experience them as a fake, then walk out of the room and interact normally with the nurse in the hallway. The nurse does not generate a delusion of substitution. The spouse does. This pattern is the opposite of what you would expect if the problem were simply one of perceptual face recognition. If the patient could not recognize faces, they would fail to recognize the nurse too. The selective targeting of emotionally significant people suggests that the problem is not with the perceptual recognition pathway, which appears to work normally, but with the emotional familiarity pathway. Ramachandran tested this hypothesis by measuring galvanic skin response, the autonomic skin conductance response that reflects emotional arousal, in a Capgras patient looking at photographs of known faces. In neurologically intact people, photographs of familiar faces produce a measurable autonomic response that photographs of strangers do not. The Capgras patient Ramachandran studied showed normal autonomic responses to photographs of strangers, but no autonomic response to photographs of his own family members. The perceptual recognition was intact. The patient recognized the faces as his relatives at the cognitive level. The emotional arousal response was absent. The brain's automatic signal that this face belongs to someone important was not being generated. The patient's brain was telling him, "This face matches my family's faces in every perceptual detail, but it does not feel like my family." And the brain had constructed a narrative explanation for this perceptual emotional mismatch. The person in front of him was not his family member, but a remarkably accurate copy. The narrative construction is what makes the Capgras delusion philosophically as well as medically interesting. The delusional belief that the familiar person has been replaced by an imposter is not random. It is the most logically coherent explanation the patient's brain can generate for the anomalous experience of seeing a face that looks completely familiar but does not generate the expected emotional response. Given the data the brain has available, visual recognition without emotional familiarity, the imposter explanation is, in its own strange way, rational. This is a point that Ramachandran and others have emphasized as significant for our understanding of how the brain constructs belief. The Capgras delusion is not a failure of reasoning. It is reasoning applied to faulty data. The patient reasons correctly from the evidence available to them, which is, "This face looks like my spouse, but does not feel like my spouse," and arrives at the conclusion that the face belongs to someone who looks exactly like their spouse, but is not. Given the evidence, this is not an unreasonable inference. The evidence is wrong. This insight connects to broader questions in cognitive science and philosophy of mind about the relationship between perception, emotion, and belief. The experience of recognition is not purely a cognitive or perceptual matter. It has an emotional component that is as real and as primary as the visual processing. And when that emotional component is disrupted, the cognitive framework that was built on top of it becomes unstable in ways that are not easily corrected by presenting additional evidence. Arguing with a Capgras patient that their spouse is real is unlikely to be effective, because the patient's certainty is not based on an argument that can be counter-argued. It is based on what they feel, or rather on what they do not feel. The clinical experience of Capgras delusion is distressing for both patients and their families in ways that are worth acknowledging plainly. The person who is the object of the delusion, the spouse or parent who is perceived as an imposter, typically knows what is happening. They understand, if they are informed by clinicians, that the delusion is a neurological condition. They understand, at an intellectual level, that the person they love is not rejecting them, but is experiencing a symptom. This does not make it painless. Being looked at with suspicion or fear or hostility by someone who shares your home and your history and who you love, being told that you're not the person they know, but a dangerous replacement, is a particular kind of grief that falls outside most people's framework for understanding loss. The person is still there. They are simply unreachable in the specific way that mattered. Some Capgras patients have acted on their delusion with violence. Attempts to find or rescue the real person they believe has been replaced, or in some cases attacks on the imposter who has taken their place. Clinical management of the condition requires careful attention to this risk. Treatment with antipsychotic medication in the context of schizophrenia can reduce the severity of the delusion. In cases associated with dementia or brain injury, the condition may fluctuate with the underlying progression of the neurological condition. The Capgras delusion is one of a family of misidentification syndromes, conditions in which the normal processes of recognition are disrupted in specific and revealing ways. The Fregeli delusion is its near mirror image. The patient believes that a single person is following them and disguising themselves as multiple different people they encounter. The syndrome of intermetamorphosis involves the belief that people around the patient are physically transforming into other people. Each of these syndromes maps onto a specific disruption of the normal recognition architecture, and each reveals something about how that architecture normally functions by showing what happens when a component fails. The Capgras delusion specifically reveals that the experience of recognizing someone you love is not a single, unified mental event, but the product of at least two distinct neural systems working in concert. one that identifies the face and one that generates the emotional resonance of familiarity. We do not typically notice this dual architecture because the two systems operate together so seamlessly that their contributions feel like a single experience. It takes a very specific kind of neural damage to separate them. When they are separated, what remains, the face without the feeling, is not enough. The brain knows this, and when it cannot produce an explanation that makes the mismatch coherent, it invents one. The imposter is the brain's attempt to make sense of a world that has become, at the level of its deepest emotional recognition systems, inexplicably strange.